Yeah, I'm gonna read from my story on abyssal waters that I wrote in Spanish in 2008. The original title is De las Aguas Abisales, and it was translated by Will van der Heijden, and it's from 2008 when writing about climate was like science fiction. And right now it's like reading this is like realistic, the most realistic thing you can do now, right? Okay, I'm gonna read it's a short story, very short, so don't worry. On abyssal waters. This will never end, I was reminded, hearing again the sound of the rain. As long as earth exists, there will be sowing and reaping, cold and warm, summer, winter, days, night. This place will never be condemned because of men. Who whispered this in my ear, hour after hour, despite the headphones or rubber earplugs I always wore, the hum I learned to make with my mouth before deciding never to speak again? Silence. In silence, I stayed until weeks later on one of my excursions, I found him sleeping with arms spread wide, naked, soaked, and barely visible out in the wetlands that now cover what was once this destined to become the launch pad for the Ark. A few months ago, the venerable Joseph Hazelwood Jr. would have been proud to have created a 2 million acre swamp. Now his mind was only capable of insulting the herd of huemules that appear in the ruins of what had once been the house's English garden, as if they gave a shit about some old drunk running toward them, flapping his arms, screaming, silence. And in silence, I sat down beside him, bringing the ultrasonic whistle to my lips whenever an Iberian lynx or anaconda or scavenging condor approached me menacingly. Days later, when my older brother sent the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, the police, and a team from the Wildlife Foundation to find us, I suffered the insults, the judgment in the press, and getting arrested without a word. I didn't owe anyone an explanation for my father's condition. The sinuous steps of a puma stalking its prey sound like a soft, almost imperceptible rain, and that sound accompanies me throughout my nights in this cell. Silence. I met them in a noisy trucker bar on the highway to Johannesburg, a place I went to eat steak when I could no longer stand my father's voice, speaking to the whole world via video conference, even on the screens in our own house, about the genocide of chickens being carried out by the food industry. That night, the bar boiled with leather-clad bikers who, without warning, would start fighting each other despite having walked in hugging, with child prostitutes sobbing and locking themselves in the bathroom, with organ traffickers suddenly paralyzed in their seats, overcome with regret for the pain their business caused among the world's poor. And all of it, every fight, every sob, every whispered confession, resolved around that person, whoever they were, sitting in the corner of the bar, eating or drinking, barely looking up at the heavy man who knelt before them, the traveling salesman spitting insults at them in multiple languages for ignoring him, the drug addict crossing the bar and handing them 3 baggies he'd been carrying in his pocket, or the little-known singer desperately begging them to marry him. Their answer was always the same: silence. I wasn't struck by their beauty. As soon as they saw me approaching, they stood up and resolutely walked out the door into the parking lot to my truck, where they waited for me to open the door for them. For once, I enjoyed the silence of the highway, only interrupted by the lights of a truck passing in the opposite direction, but not by the breathing of my companion, who only took their eyes off me when they lightly put their hand on my arm and asked me to pull over. In the fading light, I watched them get out of the truck, slowly cross the highway, and pick up a shaggy body that was clearly bleeding in their arms. It only dawned on me that it was a dog that had just been hit by a car, howling in pain, when, with a precise movement, their long fingers took what was left of its head and twisted it. Whether it was compassion or cruelty that shone in their eyes, the next crack and the body's last breath remind me again of the voice that wouldn't leave me in peace. Silence. At the entrance to the park, the precious silence between us was broken. The engine revved so loudly, even the flamingos and herons, several miles away on the surface of the artificial lake, were startled into flight, casting visible winged silhouettes across the fading twilight glow. A blink from my companion was all it took, and I drove the truck right to the Ark's hangar, where my father greeted us euphorically, surrounded by empty chairs on tables uselessly set with caviar and soy milk. The press conference, when he revealed the inevitable successions of events, data, and negligence that in the coming months would cause the oceans to rise and completely cover the surface of the earth, had just concluded. After the throng of journalists had been invited to enter the hangar, where in front of the cameras, my father unveiled the giant space shuttle he'd christened provocatively the Ark, and asked them, "Where do you think every cent of the vast fortune my father, the infamous Joe Hazelwood, captain of the Exxon Valdez oil tanker, received from the company's lawyers for taking the blame as the individual solely responsible for the world's ecological tragedy in human story went? Why do you imagine that over the last 30 years, I bought up properties across South Africa until I was able to connect them all together into a single park? To what end do you believe I've captured the finest specimens of every extant species on Earth?" Silence. The cameras were immediately shut off. No one asked my father for an exclusive interview. Not one of the 50 telephones with operators standing by to answer the imperious calls of world leaders rang. Within 10 minutes, the hangar was empty. When my companion and I entered, my father was staring, a double shot of whiskey in his hand, at the imposing profile of the Ark, ready at last for takeoff. He greeted us with open arms, talked at length about the risky visit he'd made to an illegal zoologist in Madagascar, whom he offered an exorbitant sum for the last living pair of dodos, about the stroke of luck that led him to discover a pack of marsupial wolves in a park at an exclusive clinic in Mato Grosso, about his refusal to bring aboard the Ark a unicorn some company after employing an entire lab to genetically map the fusion of an Arabian horse with a white rhinoceros, had offered him. The same anecdotes he told me over and over as we lunched on the dishes and infusions prepared daily by our Ayurvedic nutritionist and vegetarian cook were new to me in his faltering, inebriated pronunciation. I'd never seen him drunk, I realized, watching him cry out through the tears that have been years since the divine voice has spoken to him. Never tell him when to bring the animals aboard the Ark to depart for the new planet. Suddenly, my companion lifted their head and looked at my father, waiting for him to be quiet. Then, just once, before disappearing into the night, their quaking voice rose above the roll of thunder, fast approaching. Silence. You're just like Noah, drunk on yourself and you don't know how to listen. Even now, as I pass what days I have left in this cell, convicted of negligent homicide, I'll let the rain speak for me. Noah's Ark and the Tower of Babel are two versions of the same story. God wanted us to stop talking, to prick up our ears in the stillness, and to hear the rush of the abyssal waters that might drown us at any moment. Nothing can block it out, neither my earplugs, nor the hum in my mouth, nor the persistent sounds I've been making with a pencil on these pages, writing again and again how we were given the rainbow in hopes that we'd give back silence. Thank you.
My story is called Irene's Daughters, and I'll go ahead and start it now. At quarter past the hour when she was supposed to meet Ricardo Salinas, former mayor turned real estate developer, Danielle leaned against a cinder block wall and fiddled with the used iPhone she had just bought from her landlord. Everyone at home already had one, but anything with an Apple logo on it cost an arm and a leg here, and she was not exactly flush with cash these days. Besides, her policy from the very beginning had been not to call attention to herself, to the extent that was possible as a 6-foot-tall white woman with red hair. The day was soupy and hot, exactly the right conditions for a tropical squall that she expected would not materialize, because storms during this rainy season had been few and far between. She moved to the shade cast by her neighbor's canela tree and dragged her finger across the screen. Would she ever use half the stuff on this thing? She slipped the phone into the woven wool satchel she'd been carrying around since her Peace Corps days and zipped it shut. A shiny black Ford Expedition careened around the corner and slowed as it approached. Under the right wind conditions, she could detect the hum of that chassis half a mile away, her breath caught in her throat. As the passenger window slid down, a man with a coiffed salt and pepper hair and trimmed mustache leaned over from the driver's seat. "Señora Daniela?" She clutched the strap of her bag with both hands. "Who are you?" "Ricardo," he smiled broadly. "Oh, yes, she stammered, embarrassed for overreacting. But then she hadn't expected to see that particular model of car ever again, and certainly not up close. "Of course, I'm sorry." He pushed open the door. "Pleased to meet you. Excuse me for keeping you waiting." "That's fine." Climbing into the leather seat, she quickly regained her composure. It surprised her that he even mentioned being late. He must have assumed that she was one of those resident foreigners who still lived on American time. As he closed the window, sealing them in a climate-controlled pod, she involuntarily recalled the last time she'd ridden in a vehicle like this, 2 years and 3 months ago, when she gave a British reporter a tour of the abandoned unctuous tailings ponds after he assured her that anything she said would be on deep background. "Nothing on the record," Danielle insisted. "I've got a little girl." "I give you my word. I'll hire a car." A car, as it turned out, nearly identical to the company's shiny black SUVs, better to avoid suspicion. That was in the chaotic months after Danielle had resigned from Repsol and before Petroecuador took over the oil concession, after the village president filed a human rights suit with the Inter-American Commission, but before the president's husband took a bribe from the state. In fact, it wasn't exactly clear when her husband had taken the bribe, but she ended up on television, dressed in traditional regalia and looking angry and mortified, claiming the government was trying to frame him. Danielle had watched from an overpriced hotel room in Coca and felt sorry for the young woman, whom she'd met once when she and another scientist explained to the community how the soils would be tested before and after drilling. The president, the first woman ever elected in that village of Quechua families, stood steely-gazed and poised, asking when they would see the report and reminding the company that by law it had to be translated into Quechua. "We're not fools, you know," she warned in Spanish. Danielle nodded, fully aware that the company would never go to the trouble and the government wouldn't require them to. "The city is upgrading the water system out here," Ricardo gestured to the mounds of dirt piled on the sides of the street where crews were excavating to lay sewer lines. "Finally." "Mm-hmm," she muttered, distracted by fragments of her conversation with the reporter that kept slipping out of the folds of her memory. "Does the produced water get dumped here directly without any kind of treatment?" "Usually." "And do the chemicals leach into the soil?" "Into the topsoil, yes. The subsoil is clay, so it's more impervious." Humming, Ricardo commanded the 4-wheel drive over the perennially under construction road to the far edges of La Colina, where Danielle and her daughter Micaela were currently renting a flat. The town on the western edge of the rainforest was where the two of them had ended up after Danielle sold the apartment in Quito, learning too late that she was in fact more vulnerable as a whistleblower in the U.S., thanks to an arcane clause in an international trade agreement. Danielle had already whittled their belongings down to the essential and the hard to part with and signed a contract with a shipping company. She had started to scan real estate websites in Puget Sound and look for research positions at the university, to imagine camping with her daughter on the Olympic Peninsula and speaking English at the grocery store, despite Micaela's protests that she didn't want to move to Seattle because she didn't have any friends there and the mangoes would be terrible. Yet even as Danielle became more invested in the dream, she was not crestfallen when it started to disintegrate. It had a certain appealing, glamorous quality, with all the edges smoothed and the grit washed away. In other words, unreal. She didn't know what to make of this bit of self-discovery, that a life in the country in which she was born and raised now seemed like a fantasy out of a magazine. Past the end of the construction zone, they pulled onto a dirt road that clearly delineated the outskirts, a stretch of rolling brush-covered hills cut through by the occasional gravel road. Where the hills flattened into a valley hunkered a gigantic one-story house with a multi-car garage, Doric columns, and a tile roof. No rebar sticking out through the top in preparation for building another story when there was enough money. No skimping on incongruous flourishes to show off the owner's European-influenced tastes. It reminded her of some of the narco mansions she'd seen from the bus traveling through Honduras when she was in her 20s. That belongs to the attorney for the city, Ricardo informed her. The neighborhood is going to be very desirable soon. At the road's terminus, Ricardo got out of the car and opened up a map of the subdivision, showing the property extending far up the hill and the 100-plus residential parcels that had been carved out of it. This all belongs to one landowner? Yes, Jorge Santander. He lives in the U.S. now and has a few big companies there. He's trying to liquidate his assets. He tilted his head and crossed his arms in a self-satisfied way, as if reassured by an immutable truth about how the world works. You know. She did know. She learned the story of land grabbing in the central Amazon 10 years ago when she had first arrived in the country. Janet the Mamayacta, the only Quichua woman the company ever hired, had ticked off the steps on her ring-laden fingers while they flew out to an oil field on the Peruvian border. Guarani territory had been invaded by Quichua people on and off over a few hundred years, until eventually the Guarani retreated deeper into the eastern jungle. Then about 100 years ago, Spanish descendants moved down from the Andes, taking tracts of rainforest from Quichua people through heretical trickery, theft, and violence. Today, old money Ecuadorians and foreigners working for multinationals were scooping up parcels, driving prices up. So now there's a modern real estate market, Janet said. It would never occur to us to think about the rainforest as property. We've learned the hard way how the colonos handle these things. She pulled a pocket mirror out of her purse and fixed a stray black hair, then glanced at Danielle. Here, Janet offered her a sip of Coke. You look a little funny. Taking the bottle, Danielle gazed below at the carpet of trees broken up by clear cuts like a checkerboard for giants. She was concentrating hard not to vomit. She assumed it was air sickness, not morning sickness. At the time, she thought Janet's story had nothing to do with her. She was simply here to sock away money to pay off her student loans and then get a research job with the Park Service back home. Danielle scanned the lush slope and turned to Ricardo. Which properties are still available? He pointed to a cluster on the drawing, his nails buffed to a shine. We've got a larger corner property here that is just one block down from your friend Tito's plot. Tito is not my friend, she corrected him too quickly. He's an acquaintance. Yes, he smiled. Sorry. Against her better judgment, she had turned to Tito when she decided that La Colina was the most practical, if not the least conspicuous place for her to go after leaving the capital. Now she was beset by the occasional pang of regret at inopportune moments, and all she could do was wait it out. Can I see it? She asked after an awkward pause. They walked a block uphill to an intersection of two wide paths that Ricardo claimed would eventually be paved streets. The property sloped gradually into a ravine, out of which grew pahatukia and grasses that flourished after the diverse species of a native tropical forest had died off. She was not a botanist, but in the process of testing sites for drilling, she had learned many things about the jungle. Beyond the ravine, the Yanganates Mountains framed the horizon, just about to catch the setting sun. Ricardo chattered on about the proximity to the center of town, the planned green spaces, and something about him having started La Colina's first and now defunct recycling program when he was mayor. Danielle mostly tuned him out. She was picturing a two-story house with a view of these mountains, a balcony where she could sit with a cold beer every night and watch the clouds and the sun while Micaela did her homework or played with the neighbor kids. It was one of those views that could be a window on the world, or maybe a ledge. Watching the day end here would always remind her of what she knew lay on the other side of those mountains, more peaks that gave way to the Pacific Ocean of her adolescence, a link to a place and a past that stirred an unsettling ambivalence inside her, like a plucked guitar string. This is very interesting, she said, code for let's talk price. She opened her mouth before she thought about what was coming out of it, and at the various moments when she could have changed her mind, she didn't. Yes, the original plan had been to buy something small, unassuming, more difficult to seize than cash in the state-owned bank, and easy enough to sell if she needed to in a hurry. Building would take a lot longer, and she'd probably have to put up with unscrupulous contractors who think they can swindle a foreign woman. So what, she thought. She'd put up with worse. Her daughter was Ecuadorian, and Danielle had her moments. As far as home went, the situation was very clear. This was their last best option.
I'm going to be reading Wreath of Plagues, and I'm somewhat obliged to tell you that this story was commissioned by well, they give me a big long thing to read, but I'm not going to read the whole thing. It was commissioned for Reading the Current Stories from the 21st Century Sea, a project by the International Literature Festival, Berlin, 2017. So I wrote it for the festival in 2017, and I'm so glad to see it here in this anthology. And I'll read just the first few pages of the story. Wreath of Plagues. These tourists are nothing but trouble, slapping and grinding through the water in their power cruisers, searching for a place to snorkel. Better luck milking a fish, we tell them, and they give us the rough side of their tongues. It was not so long ago we were adjusting their masks, leading them to where sapphire light once shone through branched cathedrals, the coral luminous as jewels, our precious riches. Don't touch, we say again and again. This is not a treasure hunt. The reef is still the source of our living for those of us who are left, those who survived the first few seasons of sinking tourism. Who wants to visit a Hades of bleached bones? Hey, a bright pink man shouts from a vessel that has snuck up on us. Hey. We look at one another to see who's game. Our broad backs are to the sun, men and women alike, our bellies to the rubber boats as we scoop water samples into vials, scrape slime from lifeless coral, and take the reef's temperature as we would a dear child's. Out in deep water, buoys do all this and more, sending messages through the clear air to the office computers. But the sensors only monitor, not mourn it the way we do. Years now, the coral has been fading like a shadow on the water, but no help came until the tourists themselves became endangered. The scientists do not discuss what will happen if the reef dies altogether, but we can read the signs. We know our fate. The pink man believes the problem is that we cannot hear him, so he inches closer, one eye keen on his depth finder. Electronics are not magic. It insults the gods to navigate a vessel like that in shallow water. Even we in our inflatable dinghies cannot always use our outboards and must pull with our oars. But that is not our job to tell him. Not anymore. The man tests his luck and gets quite close. The cruiser begins panting in neutral. Then suddenly he is on his deck waving at us. Excuse me, over here. We groan. We are sick of explaining the obvious to the oblivious. It is too damn hot. What? One of us answers. We know, of course, what he wants, but we pretend innocence. We lean back and drink deeply of our canteens as we look up at him. What happened to this place? The man asks. He takes off his baseball cap and sunglasses and wipes his boneless face with his loud shirt. He's wide and top-heavy, like his black-hulled boat, which flies an American flag. His red hair is almost plucked clean, so with his sunburnt skin, he looks like a tufted bloodworm. His two pastel children, slick with sunscreen, and we hope it is not the slop that poisons the reef, stare at us. A pale woman, the man's wife, we guess, looks down into her wine glass, searching. An old man, A crumpled version of the pink man lies on a lounge chair with closed eyes and an open book. Do we pretend to more innocence? We do. Happened? What do you mean happened? Another one of us asked. We no longer have to be nice to tourists, so we're not. Besides, the sick reef is their fault. That is what our bosses hint at. They say our coral is dying because the world burns too much oil, and it is sure as hell not us doing the burning. Every day we must scrounge gas for our scooters to get us to the dock. The man presses his great stomach against the rail, and as he leans forward to talk to us, his skin flushes. Like the sea worm, he should not be out in the sun. We've been going around in circles. Where's the coral, the fish? I told my kids it would be like swimming in a high-end aquarium. We all look at one another as if we haven't a clue. One of us peers into the water, then sits bolt upright and shouts, "Great Zeus, the reef is dead." We all look horrified into the sea as if we don't know shit. The man cannot tell if we are pulling his tender leg. I give up, the woman says. On stormy days, we hang around the office, and our bosses show videos from cameras miles below the surface. We marvel at the strange greenish-white creatures at the very bottom of the sea. That is the color of this woman's skin. I told you we should have gone to Atlantis instead, she says to the horizon. These kids need to experience real nature, not a water park, he tells her. I don't want them to grow up sheltered from the world. He pauses as if considering. Like you. We shake our heads. You cannot speak to your woman like that, or there will be a price to pay. He has a sickly smile on his face as she whispers something to him we cannot quite hear over the hissing of the surf, either fuck you or I'm warning you. She finishes her glass of wine, turns to the cabin and disappears into the cavernous space. The children pay no mind to either of them. They have blue flippers on their feet and snorkeling masks in their little hands, ready to receive the world's blessings. We look past them, squinting into the strong sun to watch a pelican drop headlong like Icarus into the sea. We wait for him to rise in glory, a feasting bird, but he comes up with an empty beak. Even the charter boats must go far out to sea now, while our people hold empty nets on the shore. What have you done to the coral? The man asked, pointing at our equipment. The last time I was here, it was a tropical wonderland. We stare at him blankly, and some of us go back to work. We have to get ourselves to Half Moon Bay, where our bosses think they saw signs of black band disease in a healthy colony. They want us to suit up and dive with them for coral samples. Time is not on our side. I want to see the fishes, Daddy, says the little girl. I want to see a shipwreck, says the boy. Ah, so would we, on both accounts. Rusted hulks used to sit where they landed on the reef, left as a warning to other mariners. We would collect some fine things from those boats. Our homes are made with so much salvage that the priests joke that we live in salvation. But now the tourist board, grown nervous and defensive, tows the vessels out to sea before we can get to them. They say tourists do not want to see that nature's power is greater than their own. You must have been here a long time ago, one of us says. This part of the reef has been dead or dying for a good 8 years. What do you mean dead? The man asks. Have you ever seen coral? It's just a rock, a colorful rock. It is alive, or was, we tell him. Tiny animals, polyps. They grow a shell, creating hard and beautiful homes, and live on algae. We do not waste breath explaining symbiosis to this man, but tell him how the algae determines the color of coral, which grows in many shapes. We know them all by name. Elliptical star, boulder brain, corky sea finger, mustard hill, yellow pencil. We learned the language of sea life when we were guides. Now we must learn the language of sea death, not just bleaching, but disease. Yellow band, white band, black band, white plague, white pox. The reef is so sick it can no longer give birth to the tiny organisms from which spring the great chains of being. Now clear jellyfish float like dead spirits through a labyrinth of thigh bones and skulls. Warmer water stresses the polyps and they eject the algae, we say. That is the bleaching that makes them look like skeletons. Sometimes they heal themselves, but lately, no. They die in a shroud of slime. Thank you.
I'm going to read from my story, Morse Code of the Yellow Rail. I'll start also at the beginning. Daria fully expected to die by volcano, not by lahar, as say, if the 26 glaciers on Mount Rainier melted under that volcano's heat and helped to create a mud flow so big and thick and violent that it buried everything in its path, not even by ash clogging the air and trapping greenhouse gases. Even though the United States was second in the world for number of volcanoes, Daria didn't fear volcanoes in that way. No, what she'd learned from her mother, indirectly, was that volcanoes offered foolproof suicide. When the climate got bad enough, Daria would just walk right up and jump. If the fall didn't kill her, the sulfur dioxide fumes would choke her. If that didn't get her, the 1800 plus degree lava would. Though, of course, Daria never spoke this plan aloud. It seemed perfectly reasonable to her, given the circumstances, but her parents would never understand. While Claire cooked dinner, Daria was on her weekly video chat with Clara, her grandmother, the one person who reliably calmed her. For the past year and a half, Daria had been moody, swinging wildly from neutral to furious, devastated or terrified, and barely passing her freshman classes. Sometimes when she took her emotional plunge, Claire and Mateo were left bereft among the flying tephra, helpless to do anything but watch their only child fall. Sometimes she swept them up along with her into the caldera. Now, Daria was telling Clara how she'd learned that urban birds sing louder than their rural counterparts because they have to be heard above honking cars, roaring trucks, and shrieking construction tools. Clara laughed, "I know," and told her about the pandemoniums of parrots that live in the treetops above Los Angeles. "It can sound just like Jurassic Park. They're so loud," Clara said. Talking bird was a common thing between the two. Clara, who used to work as an ornithologist at Audubon de Mexico before moving to LA, liked to talk about the yellow rail, brown with golden licks of flame, tiny white vertical dashes along the feathers, bluff-colored eggs speckled reddish-brown at one end. When they're dating, Clara said, they show they care by grooming each other. Claire smirked at her mother-in-law's quaint choice of the word dating. Clara managed to be such a scientist and woman of the world and so cloistered in some distant yesteryear at the same time. If Claire or Mateo had described birds as dating, Daria would have rolled her eyes with exasperation and disdain. Yet Claire watched Daria's expression grow both transfixed and dreamy as she listened to Abuelita talk about the sweet little yellow rail of her younger days. "Have you seen one recently or heard one or anything?" Daria asked. Claire detected the anxiety in Daria's voice. Her grandmother hadn't lived in Mexico for decades, but she occasionally visited Daria's great aunts there. Clara made a sound somewhere between a tisk and a sigh. "Oh, no, they're thought to now be extinct." Daria suddenly slapped the laptop shut. "Daria," Claire said. Her daughter was staring at the closed case. "Sorry." Suddenly, Daria was reopening the computer and hitting the mouse pad to wake it. Of course, the call had already disconnected. "What in the world?" Claire asked, joining her. I freaked out and I slammed the computer shut." Daria looked like a helpless little kid on the brink of tears. It didn't mean to hang up on her. Claire ran her fingers through Daria's exhausted curls. It's almost time for dinner anyway. Send her a text. She'll understand. As Daria reached for her mother's cell phone, she went surly again, muttering, I told you I have eco-anxiety. Returning to chopping the salad veggies, Claire pressed her lips shut. She and Matteo knew all about eco-anxiety or eco-grief, even without the links to articles and Medium posts that Daria sent them. She too would like to go to Daria's counselor and be told soothingly, as she imagined Dr. Wixon but call me Anastasia had told Daria, yes, dear child of Mother Earth, this grieving, this tension you feel about her pain could be an issue. Wouldn't it be nice if that were it? Yet somehow that response seemed as comforting, meaning as meaningless as Matteo's response to their daughter, which always seemed to be an undulating combination of the world's climate is always changing, / everything we as individuals do won't be enough to matter, / might as well enjoy life while we can. When you're done texting Abuelita, would you go get the mail? Claire finally said. She listened to the sigh, the stomps, the door. Then Daria threw the bundle on the counter beside her mother and flounced toward her room. Wash up, Claire yelled. And what was in the mail was a catalog for a summer camp that deals in eco-anxiety very conveniently. And that is where Daria goes for the summer. So I'll just read a little passage to the beginning of that camp experience. Gratitude. Daria looked up. Counselor Molly, as she'd introduced herself at breakfast that morning, was standing under the oak, addressing the 10 teenagers sitting on blankets, personalized with the camp's logo. Human hands morphing to become tree branches. Gratitude is step 1 in our ecotherapy. A couple of the kids audibly groaned. A couple fell back on their blankets. Daria rolled her eyes and slapped at a mosquito. I am grateful that our systematic destruction of the environment will eventually lead to the extinction of mosquitoes, she called. A few snickers. Nah, they'll just adopt, the girl nearest Daria said. People suck. We kill all the beautiful things and make the annoying stuff more annoying. Okay, Molly said, smiling along with the laughter. Seriously, folks, you're here to learn some tools to cope with this very real form of anxiety. This is where we begin. I know it sounds counterintuitive when the world is burning. What is there to be grateful for? But there's lots, I promise you. Here's the big thing I'm thankful for. Molly sat cross-legged on her own blanket. When I was your age, I was a camper here, and all I thought about was how to pass swimming tests, and would I have my first kiss here, how gross most of the meals were, and, she slapped her arm, the mosquitoes. Daria squinted at Molly, behind whom the sun was shining. How old was she? Her mom's age? Kind of old for a camp counselor. Daria suspected she was actually a psychologist. Daria shifted and looked around. The boy Mac, they were supposed to use first names only to keep from looking each other up on the phones they didn't have regular access to anymore. But Daria had to wonder if his name was just an abbreviation of his last name, was raising his hand. Molly held up her finger to indicate he should wait till she was finished. But you're lucky, she continued in a rush, noticing most of the kids losing focus on her. You see what too few people understand, even with all the evidence before them. You're special. You are at camp to ask the hard questions and learn the tools to deal with the answers. And I'm grateful for that. Her last words were said as one long word, as suddenly the sun bore down with all its steamy might, and the mosquitoes who would not rest grew surlier, and people shifted from kneeling to sitting to sprawling to kneeling again. Yes, Molly said tiredly, pointing at Mac. I'll stop. Thank you.